The Call of Cthulhu set of games from the 1990s by Infogrammes, well, I think in some ways they complement both each other and in other ways insult one another. Now, both of these games, Shadow of the Comet and Prisoner of Ice, were inspired or based off of two of Lovecraft's works. The first one can share its inspiration with The Shadow over Innsmouth, while the other has its inspiration coming from At the Mountains of Madness. And in essence, both of these games could actually stand alone. And in fact, the only thing that really does tie them together is a character that shows up in the second game that was the protagonist of the first game. And if I want to be honest, both stories could also stand alone. There was really, you didn't have to tie them together. Now, the first one, contradictory to most things that have Lovecraftian influence in it, has a rather upbeat ending. The protagonist being successful in getting rid of the cult that held control in the town of Innsmouth, and thus earning the respect of the inhabitants of the town who were not in the cult or even affected by the cult. The second one, however, opted for two very bleak endings, and the only difference between them is literally trying to break the timeline of the coming future. So, what do they have that's similar? And why are they worked together? As I said, in the second one you encountered the protagonist from the first one, who, as he has aged, he has become a professor. Now you have to take in a note that the setting of the first game was coinciding with Halley's Comet. The setting of the second game was basically during World War II. So we're talking at least 30 years. Somewhere in there, 25 to 30 years. Because I can't remember the exact date and time of the second game. But something like an astronomical event that has dates assigned to it, you can then determine the exact timeline, or you can have a range for the year this one is set if you can't recall it or you can't find it. And the fact that he now has a daughter who is grown also adds to a respectable timeline. I don't know if it was ever said if he was married in the first game or not. However, given he was having heart problems, I could safely say that maybe he's in his late 30s in the first game. Now, I will say that both games had their decent enough interactions. Possibly with the first ones being a little bit more problematic than the second one. The second one seems more like a point-and-click adventure than the first one did. But it did fit the bill, and it was first one had, in my opinion, some nicer setups in a pseudo 3D environment. I mean, if you see how the town of Illsmith was set up, you had the buildings being seen in a like a staggered type thing when you're transferring scenes. And it also showed you where you could go in front of you. Now, the second one didn't have such a layout. Everywhere you had to go, you had a doorway on screen, which was more in tradition with the point-and-click genre. Because you never really had to worry about looking for your door in front of you. It was never, quote, in front of you. But the first one did go that route. I'm not saying this is a negative for it. In fact, I thought that was clever. So you had the same interaction with how you do things. I think the overall for them was graphics. Now, I will praise the first one because they used graphics set with with the level that they had. Now, yes, Infogrammes had also released the Alone in the Dark series, so there were teams that knew how to do a good 3D game with 3D characters. However, they didn't go that route with this one, because what they did was basically they went with the simpler 2D graphics, and for close-ups they used imagery of real people. And I say it this way because they did use some celebrity likenesses in it. I don't know how much they used, but I could definitely identify the doctor character being that of Vincent Price. And one of the cult members was literally it was Jack Nicholson as his character Jack Torrance in The Shining. Or was it from his character in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? Whichever one was more prone to wear a beanie, let's put it that way. Or a toque. Whatever you want to call the hat. So I can't imagine that this didn't go unnoticed. There wasn't enough difference, in my opinion, to not tell these two iconic faces, and I wouldn't be surprised if there were more in there. Now, they did use, they did have a talkie version. Of course, the speech part gets done before you get done reading through the actual text. So, it was a little out of sync, but of course, in that day and age, it was just starting to really incorporate more of that into these games. Now, the second one, Prisoner of Ice, that one, all the environments were literally like 2D paintings, 2D design. But they used painfully obvious 3D model characters for every human being and even for the monsters. I can't say that these are computer generated. And if they are, it's a skill level above what they should have done. And I say this because it was enabled and it was set up in that way. It looked grossly it was more obvious that you had a 3D figure on a 2D background in that game than in their other releases of the Alone in the Dark franchise. It was painfully obvious. And I think in part that was because when they did the Alone in the Dark games, they created 3D models, but they used hand-drawn, the drawings and the digitally created. And it looked relatively primitive in that case, too. So, Prisoner of Ice was just... You had over-sophisticated 4 characters, and it's like having a real person in a cartoon, where the real person isn't even turned into a cartoon. That's how jarring it is. Now, I said both of these. I might have said this already. I'm pulling a blank right now. But both of these stories could have been standalone. The fact that you had Parker tell his story about his interaction in the first game and the second game, I think it was just done to pad out the second game. Although, in turn, it would turn that happy ending at the end of the first game a little bit darker. Well, of course, at this time, none of them knew that the story of Prisoner of Ice would come along. And adding that in there, it actually does something as a sort of like a retroactive plug, so to speak. Now, this was at a time when there were still a good deal of years in a store, because you get demand for a game series. You try and keep those in stock because you never know what might happen for some games. And by tying Prisoner of Ice to Shadow of the Comet in this way, I think they hope to get more people buying Shadow of the Comet, or maybe word of mouth telling people this one's linked to this game, which Shadow of the Comet was far superior in certain ways. And like I said, it could have been a bid to sell both, because I think when these games were originally released, they didn't have the Call of Cthulhu name on them. But that is the essence of this Call of Cthulhu series from the 90s. Would I play them again? Yeah, I'm more willing to play Call of Cthulhu Shadow of the Comet again, mainly because it was a more interesting game. It worked. The second one, well, let's put it this way. I have 4 games that have Call of Cthulhu in their name in my library. And the second one I consider the least of all 4 of them. And that's definitely saying something. When a previous game can outshine a successor game, well, let's put it this way, that's just sad. Of course, then again, that sometimes is the curse of the sequel. It can never live up to the full hype of the first one, and very few sequels have surpassed their progenitor. And that's all I'm going to say about the Call of Cthulhu series from the 1990s from Infogrammes. If you've listened to this point, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Give the video a like. Share it with any friends you may have that may find these games interesting. Whether it be a curiosity or that they are a fan of the games. To anybody who is a fan of Prisoner of Ice, these are my opinions. And I'm sure that you like them for whatever reason you like them for. And I will commend you. There is reason to like the game. Great story. It was a good story. The ending is very reminiscent of Lovecraftian lore. But that's all I'm going to say now on the series of these two games. There are other games out there with Call of Cthulhu in the name, but they do not share the universe of these two games. And that's for the better. I think if all of these were in the same series, with the same timeline, um, well, it would be a hard way to mesh them all together. Again, thank you for listening, and check out some of the other videos on the channel. And have a good day. Bye.